So the bill of quantities has been set up to align with the costing spreadsheet constructed by FAME. This was done to reduce the time required to fill in this tab, as hopefully there'll be some overlap between the two documents. The bill of quantities covers data for goods, products and services that are purchased throughout a project's lifetime and has been split into 8 sections. You've got preliminaries, excavation and investigation, processing of recovered material, post-excavation assessment, post-excavation analysis and dissemination, public engagement and deposition. In addition, based on our work with other archaeology companies, plant hire has often dominated the carbon footprint. If you have seen the introduction video, then you would have seen the synthesized pie chart that we created to sort of as like a predicted archaeology company's carbon footprint based on our work with some FAME members. And within that, a large proportion was attributed to the emissions from plant hire. So to reflect this, we've separated the category from the standard bill of quantities published by FAME and placed it at the top of the input page because it's predicted to be the most significant emitting category for most projects that you're using the tool to report on. Additionally, the FAME bill of quantities is a really extensive list of inputs, and from a carbon footprinting point of view, some contribute very little to the total carbon footprint. So to streamline data entry and try and reduce the time required to fill out the tool, we've separated the bill of quantity into core and optional. So data for the core activities must be input, and where the sort of optional ones are not necessarily required, if you did input them, it would produce a fuller and more representative project footprint. But they are generally low carbon intensity categories that are less significant overall. The input process for both the core and optional is very similar. So I'm just going to run through on the core bill of quantities input. So as sort of has been a recurring theme throughout these videos, the bill of quantities provides several data quality options, and there is obviously a preference for physical units, so litres of diesel or the weight of a material, but if this is not available, then there is the option to input monetary data. But this spend-based data relies on an industry standard database called XIABase, which has very broad reporting categories. So in general, the carbon footprint is slightly less reflective of the specific activity that is being undertaken. And in addition to that, using XIABase makes it harder to reflect carbon reduction activities, as if you continue to use spend-based data, the only way to reduce your carbon footprint is by spending less. So you can't really see any of the efforts that you may be making to reduce your carbon footprint. And so this is demonstrated in the input. If the unit cell is highlighted blue, then this indicates that there is an option for a physical unit to be input, and you should try and aim to input in physical units where possible. There are some where a physical carbon factor was not available for the activity, and so if it's not highlighted blue, then the only option is to input spend-based data. Now, for plant hire and also for temporary site accommodation, which is just below here, there are 2 options for data resolution. So option 1, you can enter the physical fuel consumption. So if you know the litres of fuel consumed, whether that be diesel or biodiesel, then you input in the option 1 section. And then if this isn't available, but you know, if the litres of diesel isn't available, but you know the cost of the fuel, then you can select the pound here, use the drop down to input it. But if the fuel costs haven't been separated from sort of the cost of renting the equipment, then you can use option 2 and input the total amount spent on plant and equipment hire. So the difference between inputting pounds in option 1 and using just option 2 is that this is the pounds spent on fuel, just fuel, whereas this is the pound spent if you are unable to separate the fuel costs from the equipment hire. So option 1 uses the average diesel prices within the period that the data has been recorded to back calculate the litres of diesel, whereas this option 2 uses the XI based spend based factors that I mentioned earlier. And the same process applies to the temporary site accommodation below. So another thing to note with this is that excavator emissions are also included in the soil and excavation input tab. So it's just really important to be aware of this so that you don't end up double counting. So the estimations done in the soil and excavation input tab are more accurate than using the spend-based data as the option 2 on the bill of quantities. So I guess the first thing to note is do not, if you enter the amount spent on plant and equipment hire, and that includes the amount spent on excavators, then do not enter data into the soil and excavation tab as well. Similarly, if you're entering litres of diesel consumed by your excavators, then do not enter any data into the soil and excavation tab as well. But the sort of thing to note is that because the estimation done in the soil and excavation tab is more accurate than using option 2 here, if it is possible to separate the spend on excavators from the spend on other plant and equipment hire, then it's better to input the spend on other plant and equipment hire here, but then do the excavator emissions in the other tab. So to sort of run through that, the preferred unit would be everything for all plant and equipment hire litres of diesel. If that's not possible, then for all plant and equipment hire and excavators and temporary site accommodation would be the amount spent on diesel or biodiesel. If that's not possible and you are able to separate the amount spent on excavator emissions, then the next best option is to put to make an estimation in the soil and excavation tab for the excavators, and then input pounds spent on other plant and equipment hire and pounds spent on temporary site accommodation as option 2 in this tab. And then if you're unable to separate it, then you can just input the whole lump sum into option 2 on the bill of quantities. Just make sure, I'm going to stress it again, make sure there's no double counting happening. So the other thing to note is that some activities in the bill of quantities are required for costing, but not necessarily for carbon accounting. So these refer to activities that are performed at an organisation's office. So if we included these in the bill of quantities as well, then there would be double counting because the emissions for the office-based activities are already accounted for in the overheads tab, over here in this tab. So we have marked these activities where we think there is the potential for double counting with an asterisk. So for example, we have the health and safety plan. If that is written by a member of staff in your main office, then the emissions from writing this health and safety plan, so the electricity used to power the laptop, the heating to heat the employee, this will all have been captured via the overheads tab and then allocated to this project using the person days methodology. So in the bill of quantities, we only want to input data for externally contracted activities not performed by your organisation's staff. So now I will demonstrate a data input. Sorry, that was a lot of information. So as always, we want to input your name, select the project you're reporting on, whether it's actual or forecast data, and then the period you are reporting on, and any additional notes if you so wish. So let's enter litres of diesel. So you have several boxes to input here. So firstly, it's separated into archaeology activity and development purposes. So that's covered in the introduction video, but to summarise it a little bit here, it's basically in the first box you are inputting activity data for activities that are done purely for the archaeology industry, whereas in the development box you're inputting data for activities that would have happened anyway and were only performed by the archaeologists because they were the first people on site. So, for example, if you are putting up fences that will be there for the whole duration of the project, even after the archaeologists have left the site, we don't want to allocate those emissions just to you as just simply because you were the first people there. So that sort of thing would be put in the development purposes. This is explained in more depth in the introduction video and also in the methodology document. But yeah, that's a brief overview. So let's just say we've got 1,000 litres, and let's leave that blank for now. And then I'll also demonstrate the ones with the asterisks. Because it will the tool will sort of warn you and check that you're sure. Here we are. So data has been input for activities that may also be carried out in-house. The carbon impacts of this would be captured elsewhere in the tool, namely the overheads. But if you're sure that the data represents externally contracted activities only, then you can continue by clicking OK. Otherwise, click cancel and remove the data. So we'll just go ahead with that. And then if we go to the emissions database, we can see those two data inputs there. There we are. Now, with the bill of quantities recall, because we realise that it's a very long, I haven't even scrolled to the bottom, but it's a very, very long input page, over 100 input options. With we sort of realise that you may input a lot of data at once, and if, for example, you accidentally allocate it to the wrong project, you input it all, and then you need to amend it all, you don't want to have to do every single entry individually. So with the bill of quantities, there is the functionality that you can recall multiple entries. So looking at the emissions database, if we said we want to, if we put the wrong, let's say we put the wrong start date and end date for the record, then we can recall both of them. I will just demonstrate that. So do you want to amend multiple records? Yes. Please input the start record of the period you wish to amend. So that was 1, and then the end was 2, and say wrong dates. I will just say here that if you're recalling multiple records, then you have to ensure that the start and the end date and the record type are the same. You can't recall half forecast, half actual data, as this basic data table wouldn't be able to be filled out appropriately. So essentially everything in this table must be consistent for all records that you're recalling if recalling multiple. So now we can see that it's been recalled. And we should be able to see the data there and here. So, and then if we just want to submit it, then, please ensure that there we are. Need to input my name as well, as always. How could I possibly forget? And there's the message again. There we are. And hopefully if we go to the emissions database, we will see that it was an amendment of record 1 to 2 because of the wrong dates. The dates have been corrected, and if you go to the end, you can see that the top 2 have been amended and the bottom 2 are live. Perfect. Sorry, I realised this was a really long video, but hopefully that all makes sense. If not, then you can always refer to the methodology document or get in touch.